My name, there we go. Now we got everything set up. My name is Tafari Melisizwe. I am, among many other things, the communications coordinator for the Dignity in Schools campaign. My voice is probably the least important in the context of this conversation that we are having this early morning or late morning, depending on where you are. I know the daylight savings shift has got me messed up. So I don't know how that's been with other folks. And we are here. So again, we're doing a really fantastic conversation this morning with DSC members, colleagues, and comrades, talking about Texas, talking about Barbers Hill, talking about Darryl George, and the solidarity action that people on this call, who I will allow to introduce themselves as we proceed, went and participated in the solidarity action and traveled to Texas to be in support with our young brother, Dale George, and the broader context of what's happening in Texas and across the country. So we are going to talk a little bit about all of these things, get some updates about the trip a few weeks ago to Texas, thoughts, ideas, perspectives around the case as it stands, around the fight as it stands, and how this really can serve as another inflection point and launchpad into deeper conversations about the policies, the practices, the cultural norms that really get in the way of freeing Black children, particularly, and really holding the gap between what this country aspires to be, articulates itself to be, and what it actually is for poor working, oppressed, and class people. That gap is, I think, epitomized in a situation such as this. And so, Mama Ellen and Kameisha, if you all, I know Kameisha, you're showing some images from the press release or the press conference. If you would like to both introduce yourselves and then kind of start taking us into the case and the situation, also through sharing with some of these images.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Tafari, and thank you. It's great to see all of you this morning. I'll just be really brief. Initially heard about Darryl George's case. I don't know, it stuck with me. I guess I'm locked. I have worn my hair natural since the early 90s. Also, when I initially locked, an elder approached me about her feelings about it, and she was really upset with me. But I also know that our hair is about our resilience, it's about our ancestors. It is critical to who we are as a people. And so when I read about Darryl George, aside from the fact that I have two sons, one of my sons locked, I have two grandsons, as a matter of fact, I have four grandsons, two of my grandsons are locked. And so this issue was important to me, and it still is. Because as I move around the community, most of our young, particularly Black male children, are locking their hair, and not just locking it, but wearing it natural. And I'm also running into children who were born with this beautiful long hair. And I'm really concerned as we move into implementing the Crown Act across the states, what that may look like. And so I'll just stop there because it is an issue that is dear to my heart. It's dear to me as a people, collectively, as an individual, and then collectively. And I'll turn it over to Kameisha to talk some more about what you're seeing.
Good morning, everyone. Kameisha Smith here, pronouns she and her, with Knowledge and Constellation Center and the Mississippi Coalition to End Corporal Punishment. So Darryl George is a senior in high school. He has been in either out of school or in school suspension, where you sit in the box away from the rest of the students for 7:30 to whatever time it is that school ends. And that has been going on since August of 2023 because the Crown Act was passed that supposedly protected natural hair and natural hairstyles. But in his school district, the policy is that your hair whether natural or not, cannot exceed your eyebrows or your earlobes. And I tried to find a picture of Darryl George. He always wore his hair up in a style, a protective style with his locks. But their thing was, if he were to take it down, then it would be too long. So that created an issue in the Barbers Hill School District. Darryl George, I think, is probably the third student that this has happened to, and the second student that has sought out legal action against this particular school district. So when we heard about it as a coalition, as an organization, we wanted to definitely go and support him in this case. But before we did that, we wanted to see what other groups were on the ground working with this issue and providing support for Darryl George. Because it got a lot of national attention, but there wasn't a lot of work on the ground or as much support. So we partnered with Andrew with Texas Appleseed, who was a great help in helping us to make connections, not only with the attorney for the Darryl George case, which is Alice Booker, and also with Dr. Candace Matthews, who is over the Democratic Party in Texas, who helped to put on protests, who really called a lot of media attention to the protests and also the press conferences that were scheduled. We went down on a Wednesday, and we went down on a Wednesday. We did a protest in the neighborhood of the superintendent, and we had locticians out there that were doing natural hair. They did locks on the scene, 2-strand twists. And it was a representation of who we are. We had hashtags and we sent out social media toolkits with and some of them were in solidarity with 2-strand, and my hair is not a threat, because the connection to all of this is the over policing of Black hair and also Black bodies. And it's happening in the South, because the main problem with, not that the Crown Act was bad, it's just it was vague. And when laws are vague, it gives ammunition to people to do bad things with these laws. And so that was the case that was fought in court. And it was all around addressing length, not necessarily the Crown Act itself, which protected hairstyles, but it was all about, they focused in on length. And it was a lot that played out. It was a lot that went on inside of this case, but I'm grateful that we were able to show up for Darryl George as a community and able to take students down. And even though the case did not go in his favor, we still have some next steps. I won't talk about that now. I'll let other people chime in, and then we'll circle back around to the next steps.
No, I definitely appreciate you for that and bringing all of these things into the fold. I would love if maybe we could go to Andrew, if you could hop in and provide a little more of the context and articulate from your perspective what it was like to be on the ground there in Texas, and just give us your perspective on what was going on.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much, Jafari, and to Ellen and Kameisha and the entire Mississippi crew that made the travels. I'm Andrew Hairston. I direct the Education Justice Project at Texas Appleseed. I'm a lawyer by training, and I am the co-chair of the coordinating committee of the National Dignity in Schools campaign. I thought about this work along a 6-month timeline. So for our National Week of Action, something that we annually hold for Dignity in Schools, the Nolly Jenkins Family Center graciously hosted us in Jackson in mid-October. We were focused there on bringing accountability to the State Board of Education and having the Mississippi Coalition to End Corporal Punishment share their perspective through public remarks at a public meeting of this body, we were undemocratically and in a very racist way pushed out of that meeting that we tried to attend in mid-October as a coalition. And we very much so, in a press conference after it and in the actions that flowed from it, contextualized our work within that effort to curtail the ability of Black people across the country, and especially in the South, to talk about the real ways in which these systems are harming them, especially in their schools. So the Nolly Jenkins Family Center reached out to me in early February. I appreciate Kameisha for that shout out. Things did flow very efficiently in getting the folks from Mississippi to Texas and staging the action that ultimately took place over a couple of days. We were honored to stand with Darryl George and his family. Kameisha gave y'all a bit of the context on the Crown Act, right? And this issue of statutory interpretation that came up during the hearing on February 22nd and that unfortunate ruling against Darryl. But, to think about this family, especially Darryl's mother, who was pregnant with him basically when Katrina hit, right, who fled from Louisiana to Texas for some sense of relief, and to basically have had so many systems consistently fail them over the past 20 years is something that stood out to all of us as we were standing in solidarity in Chambers County on February 22nd. And, we're 2 months away at this point from the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board. This was a very important action to lead up to that anniversary and to generally think about how school safety and school climate policies are failing Darryl and millions of Black children across the U.S. in 2024. And so I was very honored to stand in solidarity with the Nolly Jenkins Family Center and the Mississippi Coalition to End Corporal Punishment. I'm excited for what's going to come as we think about future actions.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And like you all are rightfully saying, I think the piece, especially relating to Southern organizing, the lives of African people and African peoples in the U.S. South, and these, varying forms of forced migrations, of involuntary migrations, of environmental-based destruction, and folks, looking to find refuge and an opportunity to rebuild, repair, and restore and continue in life. And how, just as you said, Andrew, the network and nexus of systems continue to, discipline African peoples, Black peoples away from and out of being our, natural selves. I know that there was even a school superintendent who took out a full-page ad in the Houston Chronicle. I think his name was something to the effect of, was it Bob? I have it here. Make sure I have it right, because we want to get these things correct. Greg Poole, who took out a full-page article or advertisement in the Houston Chronicle, saying in support of the decision to, keep Darryl essentially in school suspension, that conformity is American. That was the argument in the line that the Poole went to. So to imply somehow that the natural state of, any child, in this case a Black child of Darryl George, is that they're somehow, being out of bounds and out of line. And that's the issue, because there's a standard read white orientation that normalizes what things should look like. And I see Mama Dianna Freelon-Foster, who also attended. If you want to pick up where I'm riffing off of there, and share a little bit about why you decided to travel from where you're based at in Mississippi to Texas in support of Darryl.
Good morning. Thank you. Good to see all of you all again. I'd like to begin, Tafari, by just saying thank you for extending grace to us and allowing us to come in the way that we desire, that we want to. Because I'll just come in the way that I'm going to come. And I'll say, first of all, that we went to stand in solidarity with Darryl George and his mother, Darisha. And I want to say something about Black solidarity. We actually went to stand in Black solidarity with them. Now, know that I stand in Black solidarity with the understanding, first of all, that all kinfolk and all skinfolk ain't kinfolk. I fully recognize that. I also stand in solidarity because I don't want anyone to misconstrue. Also, that all skinfolk, that some folk who are not skin folk are also part of this Black solidarity movement. And I think that needs to be clearly understood. Black solidarity does not require you to be skin folk. It does require you to be kinfolk. It requires us to be kinfolk and recognizing the humanity, first of all people. Kinfolk that recognize and acknowledge the history and institution of white supremacy. Kinfolk that stand up against and call out anti-Blackness anywhere and everywhere they see it. Kinfolk that understand the continued attack on Black bodies and the violence within and of both the intentional and unintentional consequences of policies that impact Black lives daily. And so we went in that spirit and in that fashion to stand in solidarity with Darryl and with his mother, Darisha. And it was the Mississippi organizers, Ellen, Nolly Jenkins Family Center, Kameisha, also with Nolly Jenkins Family Center, myself with Activists with the Purpose, that organized this solidarity action in that spirit and in that fashion, with assistance from members of the Mississippi Coalition to End Corporal Punishment. And I want to be clear that I did, because for me, it's not just about locks. It's about who we are. It's about freedom. It's about something that we've been fighting for ever since we stepped onto those ships that brought us to America to be used as chattel slavery. It did not just start yesterday. It's been going on for these past decades. Also with us was a student from Sunflower County, parents and student union, Betty Petty is that leader. And I want to be clear, because I think it's necessary that we call the names of the students who were with us, because this was an intergenerational team. It was not just adults. There were babies with us, Kamani and Rachel. There were students with us, Deja James, Shatarian Sly, Chanel White, Rodrigan Barnes, Kamani Smith, and also Cassidy Smith and Katrina Smith. Well, you know that Kameisha is one of the persons who spearheaded this. But the little girl that you saw who was getting her hair twisted, that was Kameisha's baby, Kamani. So for us, this is a family affair. This is always a solidarity affair. This is an intergenerational movement. And so we went in that spirit. We went in that fashion. And for me, it's important that we understand that and that we always uplift that. We reached out directly to Ruth, who's with DSC, and we reached out directly to Andrew, who's with Texas Appleseed and in Austin. And we reached out to Andrew because he's a part of our DSC. He's one of our comrades. And Andrew was able to bring other folk from Louisiana, from other places in Texas. And so it became a solidarity organizing action. So yes, we went in solidarity with Darryl and his mother, Darisha. We went to stand for and with our children. We went to stand and call out anti-Blackness. We went in solidarity to show up and show out in protest of anti-Blackness, in protest of the continued violence and attacks on Black bodies, in this case, specifically of this attack on our children, the violence of exclusionary discipline policies, which targets Black and brown children. When I thought about this poem while I was there, and the poem was written by an iconic figure of the Harlem Renaissance, a poet by the name of County Cullen, and some of you may be familiar with him. And the poem is titled Incident, and it says, once riding in old Baltimore, heart filled, head filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger. And so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. And that poem came to me because as my sister-in-law Marie Freelon came and was with us doing the protest action, and also you saw her picture was also because she was with us at the hearing, at the press conference that was led by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. As we were walking towards the action at the plantation, on the street, and now you got to listen to all of this. Now you got to look at this picture that's up now. You got to listen to all of this and put all of this together. Our action was actually on right where Dr. Owens is holding us this signs, right? This is not ironic. This is real. This is reality. And unless we make all of these connections, we miss the bigger picture of why we were there. So after crossing the street, my sister-in-law were on our way over to this place. Okay, thank you, Kameisha. You're right on time with what I'm saying. So we were on our way here, and a white female drove by, stuck her head out of the window, and screamed, "Go back to y'all side of the town." I want you all to listen carefully. This is 2024. Go back to y'all side of the town. Y'all, that took me back. It gave me a flashback to 1966 as a 15-year-old student, forcing the local school system to comply with the orders of Brown versus Board 1954 by simply going to my first day of school at what that time was an all-white school. Walking through a mob of white men with tree limbs, pikes, sticks, and other weapons to attack Black students for daring to exercise our rights. On that day, as I walked across that street and heard her speaking, I had that flashback. And I could hear those white men, that mob, I could hear them screaming to us, "Go back to your own schools, nigger. Go back to your own schools. Go back to y'all side of town. Go back to y'all side of town. Go back to your own schools." Fast forward, almost 60 years later since my experience, 70 years later after Brown versus Board, 60 years later after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, coming up on 60 years since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. 1966, go back to your own school, nigga. 2024, go back to y'all side of town. 159 years after the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, which supposedly brought freedom to enslaved Africans. 3 constitutional amendments which abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection of the law, and the right to vote for Black men. Abolishing all of those reconstructions, everything that has been done since the whole of the civil rights movement, after our soldiers, Black soldiers came back from World War I, all of that we've gone through. And yet it took a Crown Act to protect Black hair in 2023 when we are supposed to be free. Oh, this is much bigger than hair. This is much bigger than locks. And so I just wanted to be mindful. I wanted us to be mindful of why we were there, what we were there in the spirit of, in the fashion of, and what our work has to be, what it continues to be, who we are, what we do. And I thank you again, Tafari, for extending grace by allowing me to come in that way. Because when you opened, you said you can come in the way that you wish. And this has been with me. This has been with me in my spirit, in my head, since the day, since we went to Texas, since I stepped out of that car and that white woman yelled, y'all go back to y'all side of town. We have a lot of work to do. And this is the continuation. This is the work that we do. And we will continue to do that work in an intergenerational model. And I'll stop there because I've taken up a bit of time, but I had to come in the way that I needed to come in. So
thank you, Miss Dianna. That was actually beautiful. I mean, you really laid the framework for those of us when you talk about this intergenerational model. Thank you for the education. Thank you for all of that. I do want to call in Deanie at this time. Deanie came from Baltimore to stand with us in Texas. So Deanie, would you introduce yourself, please, and share in any way that you want to share? Then Tafari will send it back to you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Allen, for inviting me into this space. Hi, everyone. My name is Deanie Anyangwe. I am a policy analyst at the Center for Law and Social Policy, where I lead our youth justice portfolio on our youth team. And I was brought into the space by Ms. Ellen through our connection through the Federal School Climate and Discipline Coalition, where she shared that her organization was heading out to Texas to support this action and that they could use some more support, feet on the ground, just to show up for this family and for this young man, for this child, really. And so I think I was primarily compelled to make my way down there simply off the fact that outside of the commonality that we are Black, I myself currently am rocking locks, just off the simple strength that what is happening is like disgusting. And frankly, it is an example of how much the symbolism of a lot of the wins that we thought that we've had have truly just been that symbolism. And it was an opportunity for me, I think, to be awakened to just how insidious the system is and just how committed they are to breaking down Black young people and breaking down Black communities. And so I just felt like it was important for as many people as possible to show up and to do whatever folks could, bring whatever they could to the space, just to offer support and to think about what it looks like to move forward. And I think in terms of this conversation, some of the reflections, I had a couple of reflections, some that people have already mentioned. But one, namely, that when it comes to legislation, I think a huge takeaway has to be that we have to do a better job of anticipating how the other side is going to move, because we know that they will take any and every opportunity. This is the third time that this school district has done this to a Black student, right? And so we know that they will take any and every opportunity that they can get to cause harm to our young people. We know that. And so when we're thinking about the way that we frame and write legislation, that we always have to be ready to do defense. And we cannot operate as though folks will be working in our good, for our good, because we know we saw with the courts that that judge already the judge knew how he was going to rule before the evidence was even presented. And so with that understanding that the system is not on our side, we have to make sure that we're using the few tools within the system to the very best of our ability. And so that was that. I think that was the first takeaway that I had from the experience. I think the second thing for me was just the importance of people physically showing up. I think it was really surprising to me how many of the people that were present were not from the local Houston area. It made me question how what our communication strategies are in terms of the being on the fight of the people that are oppressed, because if we cannot get enough support on our own side to build up a large enough movement, Ms. Dianna spoke about solidarity. If we cannot even get solidarity amongst ourselves around a child, then like, what does that say about our commitment to our own liberation? And I think that's a question that we have to think about in terms of like, what are we willing to sacrifice as individuals? What are we willing to sacrifice as a collective to make sure that we're able to keep our young people safe? Because I don't think that we live in a culture that encourages collectivity. And I think that while for a very long time that mindset of collectivity has been what sustained us, I think that over time I've seen what's the word? I think I've seen a step back from that principle, from that value within our communities. And so we have to really start thinking about, one another in a way that's beyond the transactional. We have to really start thinking about what it means to show up and be consistent. The situation that Darryl George is experiencing currently is impacting his whole family, right? And so even as we're fighting for this major civil rights case, we also have to make sure that we're taking care of our people. We can't just use them as an opportunity to promote the collective and then not take care of them as well. And so when we're thinking about what it looks like to think collectively, that means number one, showing up, but that also means like when the cameras are not there anymore, like what are we going to continue to do to make sure that our people are okay? And so that's something that has been another point of reflection for me, even as I think about what I want to do and how I want to show up in this space, and how I want to encourage others to show up in this space. And then the last thing I think that I want to add to this conversation is around, I think a lot of this conversation has been around our right to show up in spaces with the way that we want to, in a way that honors our identity, that honors our ancestry and our histories and culture, and our cultures. I think another part of this conversation is the very real infringement on the civil rights of this young person, right? And their access to a quality education. When you think about what in-school suspension actually is versus what education policymakers position it to be, there's a lot of discrepancies, right? We know that a lot of in-school suspension environments mimic prisons, right? And so like when we're talking about in-school suspension being a quality alternative to out-of-school suspension, when we're talking about in-school suspension being a form of restorative practices, a restorative justice approach, I think that we need to call into question whether or not that's really true, because I would argue that it's not. And so I don't want to take up too much time because I'm sure that there's probably like Q&A that's supposed to happen, but those were some of the reflections that I have had since we've all collectively came together in Texas. And I appreciate you all for giving me some space to share that. And I look forward to continuing to collaborate with folks as we strategize on next steps.
No, definitely, Deanie. Appreciate that. Shout out to Baltimore. I used to live there, so definitely glad to have you in the spot. And no, I think the points that everyone has raised are very poignant, from the intergenerational effect of it. I am curious as well about what you just brought up of let's talk a little bit about, and anyone can answer this. the on the ground support in because I know the school district is like east of Houston proper. And so, and just to bring it home for folks that may not have traveled or aren't familiar with the Houston landscape. So where were you all at? And then where there were people that were from the Houston area, and did anyone get a chance to engage with folks? What were some of those conversations like? What are the thoughts of the people that are on the ground? Because like you rightfully, put on, when the spectacle leaves from like the big box mainstream media outlets, there is still the happening there. And folks like us that are closer to the ground, closer to actually doing the on the ground work there and in solidarity with our folks, have a layer of knowledge. And then just like you're alluding to, the folks that are there after, we go back and continue in our respective homes. So anyone can chime in, but did anyone get a chance to engage with some folks on the ground in Houston? And if so, what were some of the conversations that they were having? What were some of the questions that they had?
I'm happy to share some perspective on this front. So Chambers County is about 30 miles east of Houston downtown on I-10, somewhere between Houston and Beaumont, Texas, and then getting toward the Louisiana border past Beaumont. And we connected with an organizer who I met about a year and a half ago, Jared Fields, who was very responsive, who you'll see in some of these pictures in this slideshow, who directs educational equity programs at the Social Justice Learning Institute in Houston. And I'm constantly thinking and really appreciative to Deanie for this grounding of being in solidarity the day of and the significance of that, but certainly being consistent in the follow-up. And so one thing I'll mention in that vein is that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had some representatives there. One of their attorneys, Victor Jones, joined us for a bit, and they have a parallel lawsuit, very much so focused on some equal protection deprivations under the 14th Amendment and the very real gender and racial discrimination of this policy that affects Black boys primarily, right? It's written so that boys can't have this hair length as Darryl has, and is discriminatory in both ways. And so thinking about ongoing solidarity of staying in touch with Jared, we intend to keep the conversation going and to have that solidarity flow from this action in February. But also think Kameisha lifted up, Attorney Booker is the attorney for Darryl and his family. Dr. Matthews is the family spokesperson, kind of constantly checking in the coming months to make sure that we can provide support to the family directly as needed and keep thinking about how we extend the solidarity even further past, Chambers County and Houston and the rest of the state of Texas.
I would say that I spoke a lot with family members because I have family there. And honestly, because as I said, my sister-in-law came out to join us and was so excited to join us because her children were actively involved in the activist work that we do here. And so in listening to them and also in hearing the other people and specifically people that were part of specifically the people who were part of the press conference itself, there's a recognition that and I don't want to step out and say divide, because that may not be the word, but on the ground organizing, there needs to be that solidarity between on the ground organizing, professional who, sometimes we call ourselves professional groups, right? I mean, whether it be lawyers, whether it be legislators, whether it be nonprofit organizations who moved up in the mainstream or think we have moved up in the mainstream, whether it be all of those things, when it comes to bringing people together, if they're not organizations who do work on the ground, that does, as Deanie was talking about, that does not seem to take place. So it is some of the work that, that we have to do because, and she was saying things like, my sister-in-law was saying things like, well, this would never happen in Houston, right? And I know that it probably already has happened in Houston. Sometimes people don't speak out, but then with them perhaps understanding locks more. And for me, asking Dare to cut his hair was more about asking Dare to come into compliance with who you're going to be in Barber Hills, with how you're going to represent us in terms of the superintendent's loan ad in the papers. It's all of that, because you can wear your locks, but then you have to cut them a certain length. And I remember Ellen and I see Rachel is on the call, but I remember Ellen and I attended a convening that was hosted by Southern Echo. And one of the presenters brought forth a term around the whole education process and what she calls, correct me if I'm wrong, cognitive compliance. Something of that nature, in terms of even with education, it's really about cognitive compliance. If we're not engaged in the ways that we need to engage, right, by not allowing this thing to happen, right, by preventing these types of atrocities, because that's really what it is. When you said to this child that he could not cut his locks, and then he couldn't wear his locks long. He doesn't understand all of what we understand. Many of our children don't know our history, don't know America's history. So they feel like they have the freedom, because as Deanie said, the symbolism that it really is, they feel like they have the freedom to do what they feel with their hair, and they should, as they should, right? But for that school system, it's about much more than that. And I think one of the places too for us to start is to actually read that. Those of us who may not have read that superintendent's long one-page ad, because honestly, he said it all in that. And I think it was part of that really enraged Ellen and myself. When we read that superintendent's ad, I mean, that said it all. I think that answers a lot of questions. And for me, that was an excellent place to start. But I do think there needs to somehow the on the ground organizers have to be lifted up more, because when these actions are needed, that is the place where we have to bring our people from, the people who are being most impacted by many of these, by many of the things that we find ourselves now facing.
I'll just add to that, Tafari. One of the questions I asked Dr. Matthews when, we were on the ground, where are the students? Because for us, because we're an intergenerational model and this issue impacts students, and particularly Black males, my question was, where are the students? And her response was, they have such strong retaliation. But for us, when we're doing the organizing work, our young people must be in front. And then as organizers and organizations, we must give them the kind of protection that they need when they step out, because that's also part of the organizing work. Going back to Deanie's question, we need to be thinking in advance. What are the strategies they're thinking about? So when we put young people on the front line, we also have to be thinking about, the wrath will come down on them. So how do we protect students? But going back to Ms. Dianna's point, the superintendent, basically his one-page ad literally said, Darryl has to conform. Even after the press conference and the decision was made, his response was, again, this is not about individual expression. Basically, you need to come in line. And that's troubling for us as we think about our children inside these education settings. We know we can anticipate while it may not, and again, we don't know where all this going on. It could be going on in Florida. It could be going on in a lot of these places where they have implemented the Crown Act. But for places like Mississippi, what's the lesson to be learned? We don't have a Crown Act yet. Is there a lesson to be learned? And I'll stop there just in case there are some other questions. We do have one of our representatives on the call, at least she was, Representative Summers, who we work very closely with. And certainly I want to open it up to her if she would like to make a comment or have questions about anything she's heard, as well as others.
Yeah, no, definitely. And Representative Summers, as you are bringing yourself on, and thank you so much for being here as well. Fantastic answers to the questions so far. I think that there are a few things that come to my mind that are worth sharing here. One, that I want to just lift up the work that members of the Dignity in Schools campaign has done previously around producing a document called the Model School Code that looks at, and it's not a perfect document. That's not the point of it, but it is, members spent years working through figuring out how to really answer the questions of being together in a school setting, in a school environment, in a school community, in ways that are affirming, that are restorative, that are cognizant of the social, political, and cultural context that we live in now as we move to, translate and transform outcomes into more meaningful things. And so kind of like looking at transforming society through the doorway of classrooms and classroom and school policy. But as we keep talking about, we can have the most beautiful legislation written on the books. And if there's no political will to implement, no people power to force that implementation, then we know that there are other interests at the table that are beyond completely content with the world as it's organized, directly benefit from that. And so I think that it is important to acknowledge the adversarial context with which we find ourselves in and how that overlays in cases and situations like what Darryl is dealing with. This brings to mind two really quick things. I'm thinking about the whole movement to stop Cop City in Atlanta, along with other cities across the United States, and how they've been hit with RICO charges for defending land, defending water, defending each other. And so the political terrain that organizing is happening under, as you kind of spoke to, Ellen, around, similarly aged children in Darryl's case saying, hey, no, the repercussions are harsh. And it's like, yeah. And that too is used as a deterrent, because what they don't want is people to show up. What they don't want is for people to keep showing up. And because when we become inconvenient to the status quo, the contradictions and the niceties that we're often given, what we talked about earlier, symbolic and pageantry style victories, those kind of come off. And then people really start to see the real nature of the fight that we're in. But yeah, Representative Summers, thank you for joining us. Just want to, as Ellen said, just want to, alley-oop it up to you if there's anything you'd like to share, questions you'd like to ask, and then we can open it up more broadly to a conversation or, move towards a landing if folks want to.
Thank you all so much. Can you hear me okay? Oh, great. Thank you so much, Miss Ellen, for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for all the work that you're doing. I don't know the young man that just spoke. I don't know his name, but everything that he said is right on target with what we're dealing with here in Mississippi. In the House, my colleagues have been introducing the Crown Act for the past, I believe, 2 or 3 years. And so this year, after many of my colleagues attended the National Black Caucus, we decided that we were going to make this a priority issue. And so just about all of the Democrats on the House side signed on to legislation for the Crown Act that included both protections in schools and in workplaces. I spoke with the speaker before session to advocate for this legislation. I gave him stories of, the research that I had done across Mississippi. One of them was a young lady out of Bruce, Mississippi, that was nearly prevented from participating in her weightlifting competition because she had beads on her braids. There was another young lady who was a news anchor at the local TV station here in Jackson that was told that her crown braid looked unprofessional and looked like a baseball cap, and she needed to look like a beauty queen. And 2 weeks later, she was fired, although the reason was not, specifically about her hair, but we know that what that was about. And I shared all this with the speaker. Left the meeting feeling like he would consider the legislation, so we introduced it, and it was double referred. And when a piece of legislation is double referred, typically that means that it's DOA. I mean, it's double referred for a reason, so that it does not make it out of committee. Well, the first committee that it was referred to was Business and Commerce. So I went to the chairman of Business and Commerce and spoke with the speaker again, and they both had heartburn around the workplace portion of the bill. And so, in an effort to build some support and consensus, I said, well, what if we took out that part of the bill and we just continue to work on that, in future sessions, and we focus on the schools and try to protect our children. And they both seemed to be on board with that. So we got an amendment prepared, took out all that language, made it so that it would be passable. And it did pass out of Business and Commerce. So we thought we were well on our way. It's passed out of one committee. Surely the second committee would support it and pass it, because it passed unanimously out of the first committee. The second committee that it was referred to was Judd A, Judiciary A. And it was referred to Judd A, I assume, because of the civil penalty that was included in the legislation. And mind you, our legislation has modeled other states. We got it vetted through Dove's policy team to make sure that it was good to go. I've been working with a young lady named Faith Finity out of New Orleans, who kind of started this advocacy movement a couple of years ago. We got Black Women's Roundtable a part of it. So we've been doing all the things that I thought we needed to do to get this legislation passed. Spoke to many youth groups, including Jackson State University, the NAACP Youth and College Division, etc. So it lands in Judd A. The deadline was March 5th, and the chairman refused to put it on the agenda. And if the chairman doesn't bring it up on the agenda, it's dead. I went to him for several days. I had colleagues go to him for several days trying to convince him to put it on the agenda and pass it out. And the thing that he brought up was the Texas issue. He said, I was in the gym, which we know is a lie. If you look at him, you know he ain't going to no gym. He said, I was in the gym and I saw on television that, there was this issue going on about the Crown Act in Texas. Do you know much about it? And at the time, I was only aware of it based on what I saw on social media. I really had not dug into it. And so I said, well, let me read up on it and get back with you. His issue was that the Crown Act did not protect this young man, as we now know it did. But the issue was around length, right? The issue was around length, saying that the legislation did not specifically add length to it. And so I told him, I said, well, if that's your main apprehension, let's add that to the language so we can get it out. And he said, well, I just don't know, he just kept giving me the runaround. So on March 5th, the day of the committee deadline, I went back to him, and we had a school group there, a group of Black students who had, locks, braids, coils, twists. They were all sitting in the gallery. And I said, do you mean to tell me that because these children, I pointed to them, wear their hair, they should not get an education? They should be prohibited from going to school or join extracurricular activities or whatever it is that they want to do? And he didn't have an answer to that. And he said, I'm sorry, Miss Summers. He said, I like you, but I'm just not going to bring that out. He really didn't give me any other justification besides that. And so, needless to say, I was extremely disappointed. that we would not want to protect our children in this way. And it's been on my mind ever since. And it really, I guess, dug deep in me, because on Thursday, we passed legislation in the House that would prohibit trans students from staying on dorms and campuses. And the reason behind it was because there was one young lady. This was the only, example that they could give me. One young lady who, and the university was unnamed, who felt uncomfortable that a trans student was staying in her dorm. And so what struck me was that, any way that we can find to continue to marginalize communities, we are ready to do that. We move forward with doing that. But when it comes to affirming students, when it comes to affirming students of color and other marginalized community, we stray away from that. And so, the young man talked about political will. I think that, we need to increase the political will through more advocacy and more storytelling. We need students in these Republican districts reaching out to their legislators and telling their story and telling them why this bill is important. I wish I had time to do that this session, but I just ran out of time. And honestly, I thought that the legislation was okay, that it was going to be okay, because the speaker confirmed to me that if I made that change, that he would help me to push it through. I did go back to the speaker after speaking with the chairman of JUDA, and he told me that the chairman has the right to decide whether or not he wants to bring legislation out. But we know that speakers determine what legislation comes out and what doesn't. And he did not hold up his end of the bargain. So yes, we do have much more work to do. We always say that a bill is never dead. However, this would have created a new act, so there's no code sections that I know of that are available to make amendments as we move forward with the session. And so that means that we need to take the next several months before we come back in January to build up a campaign and get this through, and really use what happened in Texas to this young man as lessons learned, to make sure that we have a very strong piece of legislation. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Representative Summers. I appreciate you being on. Please, we will definitely follow up with you to do the work we need to do on the ground here in Mississippi. Thank you so much for being here. And can we get a copy of that legislation? Because I looked. What's the bill number? Is it House Bill?
It is House Bill, I think it's 687. Hold on.
You said it was double referred. There's a Senate side.
No, it was double referred to two committees in the House. There was a Senate bill as well that Senator Turner Ford authored. Yeah, it's House Bill 687. The amendment is not on the website, but I can send the amendment to you so that you'll see that it just talked about schools.
Okay, we will definitely follow up with you on that. Thank you so much.
And let me say this other thing too, because when I talked with the chairman in Business and Commerce, we had about 30 members to sign on to this legislation. And he said, but you don't have any Republicans on here. It was all Democrats. And I took offense to that, because they pass legislation all the time with just Republicans on it, And so he was trying to discount the importance of the legislation because there were only Democrats on there. And in Mississippi, all the Democrats are Black folk. We only have one white Democrat in the House and two white Democrats in the Senate. And so assumingly that means that we need to get Republicans on board with signing on to the legislation as well.
Yeah, we hear that quite frequently. Thank you for that note. We appreciate you. Yeah, we do appreciate you, and we will definitely follow up and be in touch. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. No, thank you. So yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for all that. This, shares what we all already know, that you know, these are instances that speak to a general, broader, as Mama Dianna brought us to longer, deeper, issues that remind me of something of the former political prisoner, former member of the Black Panther Party, Dhoruba bin Wahad, where he says something to the effect of, history may not repeat, but it can rhyme. And I think that there's a lot of rhythm, unfortunate, in the ways in which we, from the state house to the federal house to the courthouse, there's a lot that, we're hearing the same kinds of things that we've heard, particularly in a moment of increasing advocacy, radicalism, and folks looking to get involved, with, be it Palestine, be it Congo, be it Haiti, be it Cop City, be it now coming back around in the election season at the federal level in the United States. Like, folks are looking to get in. And so we hear, and this is why I think the value of political education becomes so important, because then it gives us the opportunity to know that, we are in a unique moment, but the conditions that produce that moment are not new, and that they are knowable and to some extent predictable outcomes, in terms of how people will react that are trying to keep us out of the the freedom that we deserve. So as we move towards the closing, there's one piece I do want to share with you all, but before we get to that, I want to see if there's any kind of to borrow from Dr. King, a little bit of a where do we go from here? Not necessarily chaos or community, but where do we go from here in terms of what you all see or think are the next steps legislatively, socially, culturally, that people can pick up to support, Darryl, obviously, specifically, but then more broadly, this kind of, again, cultural practice of mainstream political politics to, again, dole out symbolic victories and attempts to bring people into the party, be it Democratic in this case, Republican or otherwise. And then once the election cycle goes away, folks kind of go back to business as usual. But so from what you all are seeing and thinking and hoping, what for folks that watch this video later, what are you all involved in? What do you think are next steps that people can take to support work around the Crown Act, work around Darryl, and so on and so forth? And anyone that would like to answer can go ahead and hop in with that.
I'll go ahead. I know before we left Texas, one of the things that we did, the press conference we held with Congresswoman Jackson Lee. I sent an email to her last week to follow up, because one of the things she said during the press conference was to reach out to the Department of Education and the Department of Justice for guidelines and understanding that the Crown Act must be liberally implemented. So one of the things she was supposed to do was to reach out. I followed up with an email trying to schedule a time when we may be able to meet with her around what did she hear from the Department of Justice, given that she's not on the committee that really could influence the Department of Education, but she is on a committee that is kind of, I guess, oversees DOJ. So that's one thing we're going to do. Before we left Texas, someone had reached out to Victor Jones. I think you heard Andrew mention him earlier. Victor is with LDF. A psychologist reach out because we all understand as people of color that racism can have an emotional and psychological toll and physical toll on the body. So there was someone that reached out to provide some support to him. We are still in touch with Dr. Matthews on the ground, in touch with Attorney Booker as well. One of the things we also talked about was what does the family need at this time? So that's a conversation we need to keep having. For a question for me, what are Darryl's educational goals? We have historically Black colleges and universities. Our hope is that he would get a scholarship or pathway into one of those universities. That's work still to be done as we think about next steps. Pulling us back together. At some point, we've got to look at a Southern strategy. around these issues, because in the South, these are exclusionary. And that's not to say it's not happening in the North, but clearly we know that the South is stuck in a place where we need to move them from. And in many Southern states, we have exclusionary discipline practices like corporal punishment, hair discrimination, you know, the whole thing when Deanie talks about in-school and out-of-school suspension, that is not a quality education. So for us, those are some of the next steps. But I think really importantly that we need to look at a Southern coalition that looks at these states that continue to do this. And of course, we'll continue to do the work on the ground with Representative Summers as we move forward as well. Ms. Dianna, rest of you.
Well, I sent a list of questions to Ellen that I think, and Ellen has actually reached out concerning many of those questions. And we will further that dialogue, hopefully, at the upcoming biannual conference of convening of DSC folk. Hopefully we'll lift those up, and also in hopes that Andrew can, well, not in hopes, I know that Andrew will pull together will develop a virtual or something where we can, because Andrew gave us a booklet regarding the Crown Act that was done by LDF. And I think that we really need to come together, because there are a lot of questions that we need to unpack inside of the Crown Act, right? So I think that's one thing that we can do definitely with the Southern Coalition that we're planning to have a conversation or dialogue with during the in April. So we are on it in those ways, and we're definitely and in terms of, we're hoping that, and really this is where folk, you know, on the call can come in with contacts. Folk may have contacts that we don't necessarily have inside of HBCUs, because it may very well, because I mean, let's be honest about this. Darryl is, I mean, this is a junior in high school. He's about to go through to his senior year. And a decision has already been made, right? The judge has already made the decision that the school is not out of compliance. And so I'm thinking the next thing that he's going to be asked to do is to cut his hair, or either he's going to remain in that off-school alternative school setting. And so that means that, what do we do? And I would think that because there are pathways for students who are juniors to go on to universities, or on to colleges, on to community colleges. And I think that's one thing, a conversation. Well, first of all, I think we need to determine how, if that can happen. And if that can happen, then the folk who are closest to Darryl and his mother begin to have that conversation with him, if we can make it happen, if it can happen. But you know, he's not 73 years old. I'm 73 years old. I mean, I can put up, you know, I can take a lot. He's not our age. He's not even Deanie's age. Deanie, in her profession and who she is and her knowledge, I mean, she can accept a lot. But we're talking about a 16-year-old student who's a junior in high school, who afterwards cried. He and his mother were so devastated, so traumatized by the judge's ruling that he cried. They could not speak to anyone. All he could say to the folk who went to him to calm him was, why? Why about my hair? Why about my hair? All I want is an education. Why about my hair? That is total frustration. This child is totally overwhelmed. And so how do we help with that? And it may be that he can get an early pathway to an HBCU. And I think that's something that we really need to look into.
Yeah, from speaking to Dr. Matthews, I do want to say that she did mention a 4-year scholarship to one of the universities in Texas. I just sent her a message to confirm that, but she is definitely still working with the family, and trying to secure him scholarship for when he goes to college. He will stay in that school because of the lawsuit. Attorney Booker did file something else, taking it a step further than that ruling that the judge made. And also, like it was mentioned before, we do want to stay in contact with our Texas cousins, because I've continued to talk to Dr. Matthews, and she's planning some things with policymakers and legislators on the ground in Texas. So we'll try to stay in contact and as much as we can let people know what's continuing to go on, just in a broader perspective about education and culture. As you may know, the coalition hosted its first education and culture conference on last year. So we want to do the same thing this year. Haven't identified a date, but just as we have a conversation about all of these issues that just keep coming, we need to center our voices in this education and culture piece and really come out of it with a strategy that works for us and action steps. So just look forward to that. You can look on the Mississippi Coalition to End Corporal Punishment website for updates, to stay involved with the work that we have coming up.
I would just say I think that one thing that we could and should really start thinking about in terms of a next step is a stronger youth engagement strategy, and like thinking about not only what it looks like to bring more young people on the ground into the work, but also how to give them the skills that they need to like lead in these spaces. That way they can have the conversations with policymakers and like confidently be in those meetings and not feel like because they're young they don't have anything to offer or contribute. And so I think that that's one thing. Personally, I'm working on some stuff around in-school discipline, in-school suspension specifically, because I think the other thing we need to do is start to think about how we can strategically take away the tangible tools that we know the state uses to violate and threaten our young people. And so I think thinking about strategies of those specific ways that they use to punish our young people, such as in-school suspensions, is something that should be part of whatever strategy that we're putting together collectively.
And I'd just like to add on to Deanie with that, because I really want to ditto the stronger leadership in terms of youth, but add into that political education, as Tafara has so clearly stated, assuring that in all of our leadership programs with young people, that we have that political education component.
Thank you so much, everyone. Andrew, did you want to hop in?
Yeah, generally, on behalf of the Dignity in Schools campaign, I just want to thank you all for your zealous advocacy and your membership. We're looking forward to our biannual meeting in Richmond in a month, and Mama Dianna and I will co-present a workshop, I think, on this topic and some other things. And we're focused very much so on that 70th anniversary of Brown that's approaching, as I mentioned, and other folks did, but also looking towards some of that regional programming leading throughout the rest of 2024 and into 2025 of connecting the dots even more around intergenerational organizing, youth development, and really speaking on the liberation of Black people that we're all seeking to achieve through our imperative work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone that joined. And I am, as promised, going to leave you all with a piece to think on. Let me say it like that. Anyone that knows me knows I always got a book. And as we were talking, there were a few books that came to mind, and one I'm going to share with you all today comes from a collection of essays on and about a brother by the name of Dr. James Turner, who was, I know it's showing up funny here, but was, among many other things, the founding director of the Africana and Black Studies Center at Cornell University. And but less important that it's at Cornell, and more important that it's Black Studies and that his work is incredible. But there's an essay that he wrote that I'm going to read from at length. It may take about 2.5 minutes, but I think it's an important landing and launching pad from the conversation that we're having here. So this essay that he wrote that's titled Black Nationalism, The Inevitable Response, goes, and this is from the introduction of the essay. It says, the political history of Africans in America is characterized by two predominating themes: attempts to oppress us and our determination to resist and free ourselves. We have believed freedom to mean different things at different times and in different places. We thought that it was emancipation from being a slave, or sit-ins for equal use of public services and facilities, or a crusading bus ride through the South for social integration, or voters' registration so Black people could vote for the white politicians who were controlling the government. All of these thoughts about freedom were basic to the assumptions we accepted about the nature of American society, which were in fact derived from white America's description of itself. But being a flexible people and not one to hang on to false goals, each time we arrived at a stage and saw that the freedom was not there, the movement pushed onward. The venerable scholar and political analyst C.L.R. James remarked that the African struggle in America has the richest political heritage in terms of continuance over time, consistency of growth and development through stages. Speaking about the failure of assumptions and the dialectic of the Black movement, C.T. Vivian, an ardent participant in and maker of the recent 15-year civil rights phase in the history of the struggle, writes, the first and perhaps most fundamental assumption with which we began was that integration would be the route to Black freedom. And this was an inherent part of all of our other assumptions. The concept of integration won our allegiance because it fit our understanding of how the people of a culture should relate to one another. It fit our understanding of the values which should determine the institutions and priorities of a society. It did not, however, fit American reality. And the measure by which we misjudge that reality is precisely the measure of the yawning gulf between Blacks and whites. He continues, altogether, they show how completely the Black subculture accepted the pronouncements of the dominant majority, but in our actions, we proved each of these pronouncements false. And as this happened, we came closer to a definition of American, which would allow us to operate effectively. But until this happened, we were impotent. As long as we believe what the nation said about itself, we chose strategies which were bound to fail. The fall of these assumptions changed most of our strategies and many of our tactics. Individual whites of goodwill are as powerless against the system as we, the excluded. Yet it was not until we saw the structures in which these men lived and worked reject their voices that we learned that individuals, Black or white, cannot affect change in America. The structures of the nation respond only to amassed power, not to verbal or moral appeals. Last piece. History might have taught us this lesson if we had listened, but this was something we came to learn through our own struggle and failure. America would not give us our rights just because we pointed out that it was the correct thing to do. Rights, after all, are potential power. We were looking at justice and equality before the law as moral, ethical, and human questions. Those we faced saw more accurately that these were the coordinates of eventual power. This was too high a price for America to pay for a mere moral principle. We had to learn that what we had to learn was that when white America gave it to us, it was for its good, not ours. And I think that's just a very poignant way to, think through how this applies to the tactics, the strategies, the trajectories, the directions, and treating this type of thinking with because a lot of times these types of thoughts are talked about are watered down as, oh, that's radical, that's fancy talk, that's whatever. But thinking through these things is as he framed it in the beginning, it's like a maturation of political development to come to these recognitions. And then what tactics and strategies emerge out of the recognition that the symbolic victories that we're given are more symbolic than victories. And it's not to say they don't provide substantive relief when and where they do. We're just saying that on the whole, they are inadequate. And I think it's important to, walk with that as we, walk with our folks. But that is it for what we have today. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Again, the video will be, put up, people share, we can continue the discussions. Thank you for your time this Monday morning and Monday afternoon. And we'll talk soon. Take care, y'all.